Welcome back, everyone. Great to have you with us again as we continue to explore Dr. Paul Williams' book, Lawyering Peace. Today, we're going to be diving into Chapter 2, Power Sharing. This is a concept that's it's essential, I think, for conflict resolution and building a lasting peace.
Yeah.
So we're going to be unpacking how societies kind of grapple with this question of who gets power and how sharing or not sharing that power shapes their destinies.
It's really fascinating how we often view power as this finite resource, like a pie that needs to be carefully divided.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that, like, strategically sharing power could actually expand that pie, leading to more stability and prosperity for everyone? This chapter really challenges that traditional view of power.
That's an interesting idea. So it makes you wonder then if sharing power can genuinely pave the way to lasting peace, or if it just ends up creating a whole new set of problems.
It's not a simple answer. The chapter kind of explores how power sharing can be a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On one hand, it can be a powerful tool for peace building. Imagine a society recovering from a brutal civil war. Giving marginalized groups a seat at the table allows them to voice their grievances and actively shape the future.
Right.
This sense of ownership and participation can be incredibly effective in preventing the cycle of violence from restarting.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, though, about the other side of the sword. How can power sharing backfire?
Yeah.
What would that look like?
Picture this. Power sharing implemented too quickly, without the necessary safeguards in place. It could become a tool for manipulation, allowing groups to seize control and further fuel the conflict. The chapter highlights the example of Colombia in the early 1990s.
Colombia.
Yeah.
Okay, what happened there?
In 1991, Colombia adopted a new constitution with the goal of decentralizing power. It was seen as a key step in their peace process. They introduced direct elections for mayors and governors and started giving regions more control over finances and administration. On paper, it seemed like a promising move towards peace.
Yeah.
So where did things go wrong? The problem was that insurgent groups who had been battling the government, they were able to infiltrate these new power structures. Decentralization, without a strong central government to enforce rules and protect the process, ended up empowering those committed to continuing the conflict.
Oh, wow.
It's a stark reminder that power sharing without the right safeguards can be detrimental.
Yeah, it sounds like power sharing isn't just this magical solution.
Right.
It's this complex tool that needs careful and strategic implementation.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just about sharing power, but about how that sharing is structured within the government itself, I guess.
Absolutely. The chapter dives into the flavors of power sharing, the different ways it can be implemented.
Okay.
It's like choosing a recipe for your government. Do you opt for a unitary state, a devolved unitary state, a federal state, or maybe even a confederal state?
Right.
Each structure has its own set of advantages and disadvantages.
Okay, let's break down these different state structures. Let's start with the unitary state.
Sure.
What is that?
A unitary state is like a pyramid,
Yeah.
with power concentrated at the top in the central government.
Okay.
Countries like Albania, Iran, and Sri Lanka are examples of unitary states.
Got it.
Regions or provinces might exist, but they derive their authority from the central government and have very limited autonomy.
Okay, so there's not much power sharing happening in that structure.
Not in the sense of vertical power sharing between the central government and regions.
Okay.
You might see some horizontal power sharing within the central government itself,
Right.
but the regions have very little say in how things are run.
Okay, so then what's a devolved unitary state? How does that differ from a unitary state?
Think of a devolved unitary state as a unitary state that's decided to loosen its grip on power a little bit.
Okay.
The central government still holds ultimate authority, but it chooses to delegate some powers to regions or provinces.
Okay.
Countries like Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom are considered devolved unitary states.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So it's like a compromise, giving regions some autonomy while maintaining central control.
Precisely. In Spain, the central government has devolved substantial powers to its 17 autonomous communities,
Okay.
covering areas like local finances, education, healthcare, and even local policing and language.
Wow.
However, this devolution of power isn't as entrenched as it is in a federal system.
Okay.
The central government can retract some of these powers if deemed necessary.
Got it. What about federal states?
Yeah.
How do they approach power sharing?
Federal states, like the United States, Germany, and Malaysia, they have a more balanced division of power between the central government and regional governments. In these systems, regions have their own constitutions, their own elected legislatures and executives, and even their own court systems.
Oh.
They enjoy a greater degree of control over their own affairs.
Okay, so it's more of a partnership between the central government and the regions,
Yeah,
with each level of government having clearly defined areas of authority.
that's right. Power is explicitly divided, often outlined in a constitution or similar document, ensuring each level of government has its own sphere of influence.
Got it. So we've covered unitary, devolved unitary, and federal states. Are there any other types of state structures?
For those who prefer a highly decentralized structure, there's the confederal state.
Okay.
In this system, independent states come together for specific shared goals but retain most of their own power. Switzerland is a rare, modern example of a confederal state where cantons have a high degree of autonomy.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So that's quite a diverse range of options for structuring power sharing. Let's imagine we've chosen our state structure. How do we actually go about dividing the power within that structure? Who gets to decide what?
That's where the real tug of war begins. National governments naturally want to maintain control over matters considered essential for a sovereign state. Things like foreign affairs, defense, and the economy.
Yeah.
However, regions or groups, often those who have felt marginalized in the past, fight for control over issues that directly impact their lives.
Right.
This includes areas like education, local laws, natural resources, and even their own police force. Yeah.
So it's about striking a delicate balance then
Yeah.
between protecting national interests and addressing these regional concerns. Are there any real-world examples that demonstrate how this plays out during peace negotiations?
Absolutely. The chapter highlights the case of Bosnia, which provides a compelling illustration of the challenges and complexities involved in dividing powers.
Bosnia. Tell me more about what happened in Bosnia.
The Dayton Accords, which brought an end to the Bosnian War in 1995, they established a very complex power-sharing arrangement. In an effort to appease all sides and prevent further conflict, they created a system with a central government that has very limited powers and two ethno-territorial entities, the Republika Srpska and the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Each entity has a high degree of autonomy, and within the federation there are even more layers of power sharing, with 10 autonomous cantons, each with their own set of powers.
Wow, it sounds like they really tried to ensure that all groups had a voice in the new government. Did this complex system ultimately work?
The outcome has been mixed. While the Dayton Accords did succeed in stopping the fighting, the highly decentralized structure has led to a lot of gridlock and inefficiency. Because power is so dispersed, it's often difficult to get things done, which has hindered Bosnia's progress in areas like economic development and political reform. Some experts even argue that this decentralization has made Bosnia more susceptible to outside influence and manipulation.
It seems that even with the best intentions, power sharing can have unintended consequences.
Right.
It's a reminder that finding the right balance between addressing past grievances and creating a functional and effective government is crucial.
Absolutely.
But before we move on, I want to revisit a concept you mentioned earlier, fiscal decentralization. Why is it so important in the context of power sharing?
Yeah. Fiscal decentralization. It's all about money. Who gets to collect taxes? Who controls spending? And how those resources are distributed fairly. Imagine trying to run a household, where everyone shares responsibilities, but only one person controls the budget. That's essentially what happens when you have a power-sharing agreement without proper fiscal decentralization.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster. Even if you have like a well-designed power-sharing structure, like on paper.
Yeah.
If one side controls all the financial resources, the systems, it's bound to fail.
Exactly. The chapter delves into various approaches to fiscal decentralization. In some systems, the central government maintains tight control over the purse strings, while in others, regions have more financial autonomy.
Okay.
The key is finding a balance that provides for both national needs and regional autonomy.
I imagine that fiscal decentralization can be a major sticking point during peace negotiations.
Yeah.
After all, no one wants to relinquish control over financial resources.
You're absolutely right. The chapter highlights the case of Yemen, which exemplifies the challenges of fiscal decentralization.
Yemen.
Yeah. The proposed constitution aimed to transition Yemen from a unitary state to a federal state and included provisions for substantial fiscal devolution. However, the southern regions, which were the primary oil-producing areas, expressed concerns that a national revenue fund designed to redistribute resources would actually deprive them of their fair share of the oil wealth. This disagreement, along with a host of other factors, contributed to the collapse of the peace process and the unfortunate return to conflict.
It's a powerful reminder that getting fiscal decentralization right is absolutely essential for building lasting peace.
Absolutely.
Speaking of crucial elements, we've discussed the what and the how of power sharing.
Right.
But what about the when? The timing of implementation must also play a significant role.
You've hit on another critical aspect. The question of timing, the pace of decentralization, is one of the most challenging dilemmas facing peace negotiators. Moving too quickly can create chaos and potentially undermine the entire process.
Right.
But delaying implementation for too long can breed distrust and provide opportunities for those who benefit from the status quo to sabotage the peace deal. It's like navigating a minefield where both speed and hesitation can have explosive consequences.
Do you have any real-world examples that illustrate these dangers?
The Philippines offers a compelling example of the challenges that can arise when decentralization takes an extended period.
Philippines, okay.
Yeah, the conflict between the government and Moro insurgents in Mindanao, it lasted for decades,
Right.
with various attempts at autonomy agreements and peace deals. One notable effort was the 1996 Final Agreement, which laid out a phased approach to decentralization with a planned transition period of several years.
It sounds like a reasonable approach, attempting to implement these complex changes gradually. What was the outcome?
Despite the phased approach, the violence actually reignited because another militant group, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, felt excluded from the process. The lack of their buy-in, even with a seemingly well-paced timeline, ultimately undermined the agreement. It highlights the importance of inclusivity and ensuring that all key stakeholders feel represented in the process.
Even with a carefully planned timeline, success isn't guaranteed if key groups feel left out. It reinforces the idea that power sharing is as much about perception and inclusion as it is about the technical details. Yeah. Are there examples of more rapid transitions to decentralization? And if so, what were the outcomes?
Macedonia provides an interesting case study. After the 2001 Ohrid Agreement, which aimed to address the grievances of the ethnic Albanian minority,
Okay.
there were significant delays in implementing the agreed-upon devolution of power.
Yeah.
The legislation necessary for decentralization wasn't adopted until 2004, more than 3 years after the initial agreement.
So not exactly a swift transition. Did these delays jeopardize the peace process?
While the delays did create tension and uncertainty, Macedonia ultimately managed to avoid a return to conflict. However, the chapter emphasizes that, in many cases, such delays can erode public trust and raise doubts about the government's commitment to genuine change. It underscores the importance of establishing clear timelines and demonstrating a commitment to following through on agreements.
It seems finding that sweet spot between urgency and meticulous planning is crucial.
Yeah.
What about situations where there isn't a defined timeline for decentralization? Does that create additional challenges?
Absolutely. Nepal's experience after its civil war ended in 2006 illustrates the dangers of ambiguity regarding decentralization timelines. The peace agreement called for restructuring the state, moving away from a unitary system toward a more inclusive and democratic model,
Right.
but it didn't specify a timeline for implementation.
So they agreed on the what, but not the when. What were the consequences of this lack of clarity?
As you might imagine, the absence of a clear timeline created a lot of uncertainty and opened the door for political maneuvering. Disagreements over the number of provinces, the extent of their autonomy, and the usual political wrangling all contributed to delays.
Yeah.
It was only after a devastating earthquake in 2015 that the major political parties finally reached an agreement on a federal structure with 8 provinces. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force action, but it shouldn't have to come to that.
A clear and well-defined timeline appears to be a vital component of successful power sharing. We've delved into the intricacies of power sharing and examined various real-world examples. But let's take a step back. Why should our listeners care about this?
Yeah.
How does power sharing, whether in Bosnia, Nepal, or elsewhere, affect their lives?
That's a great question, and one the chapter encourages us to contemplate. The balance of power, whether at the national or local level, shapes the world around us.
Hmm.
It influences the quality of governance, the distribution of resources, the protection of human rights, and ultimately the stability and prosperity of societies. We might take these things for granted, especially in stable democracies, but for those who have lived through conflict where the balance of power has been violently disrupted, these issues are deeply personal and incredibly important.
Even in seemingly stable societies, the distribution of power significantly impacts our daily lives.
Right.
Access to quality education, healthcare, and even the responsiveness of our local government
Yeah.
are all shaped by how power is structured and exercised.
Precisely. Understanding power sharing isn't just about comprehending conflicts in distant lands. It's about being informed citizens who recognize how these dynamics play out in our own communities and on a global scale. It empowers us to engage in meaningful conversations and advocate for a more just and equitable world.
Before we conclude, I'd like to hear your key takeaways from our deep dive into power sharing. What are the most important points you want our listeners to remember?
First and foremost, power sharing, when implemented effectively, can be a potent tool for peace building and fostering more just and equitable societies. It's about addressing the root causes of conflict, giving marginalized groups a platform to be heard, and building a system where everyone feels they have a stake in the future.
So it's about moving beyond the notion of power as a zero-sum game and recognizing that sharing power can create a larger pie that benefits everyone.
Exactly. However, and this is crucial, power sharing is not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It's a complex process that requires careful planning, a deep understanding of the context, and a genuine commitment to inclusivity. Getting the pace of decentralization right is critical, as both rushing and delaying can have serious consequences.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave our listeners with a final thought, something to ponder. If understanding power sharing is about being informed citizens and recognizing how these dynamics play out in our own communities and on a global scale,
Then the question becomes, what role can each of us play in shaping a more equitable balance of power, not just in our local communities, but also on a global stage?
thank you so much for this deep dive. It's been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.